Well, welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, right here in Middletown, Connecticut. My guest today is Steve Krevisky, one of the most favorite math professors, which is always a distinction because math is not usually the place where you find a most favorite professor, but he's one of the most favorite professors here at Middlesex, and he's also a tremendous expert on the history of baseball. And as we promised earlier in the summer when we were projecting ahead to the World Series and what this whole season would be like, we said we would get back right after the World Series ended to Monday morning quarterback and to mixed metaphors, football and baseball, and talk about the season. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that. And for you listeners, if you stayed up for last night's game, it was definitely a late night, going extra innings plus the rain delay.
Well, so I know, a 17-minute rain delay. I mean, so we have a whole show. We could talk for hours about this. But this is our very short first segment, so I have to call you out as the ultimate prognosticator of who might end up in the World Series, because just this morning I went back and checked the show, and on the National League you were very clear. The Chicago Cubs would probably make it to the World Series. So I'm in awe of your ability to project into the future. You said they had the best record, and although as a true academic you have to qualify it, so people sometimes who have the best records don't make it, but at that point they had the best record. And on the American League, you said there were no clear favorites, but you mentioned teams. You mentioned the Red Sox, the White Sox, Kansas City, Texas, San Francisco Giants, who have won the World Series for the last 3 even years. But you also mentioned the Indians, the Cleveland Indians, and you said there are a lot of probable no names, but they might be able to make it. So, Steve, you pretty much, in my mind, you pretty much called it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here we go. So the Chicago Cubs, who would have been my favorite team, did triumph. But this was one of the longest series. They played all 7 games. They played an extra inning. They won it by 1 point. So this must have been a nail-biter for all the people who really love baseball.
That's a good point. I would think so, too, because there were some strategical issues throughout the series, but especially last night about pitching and stuff like that. So, for instance, in the 5th inning, the Cubs manager, Joe Maddon, pulled his starter, Kyle Hendricks, who had been very good. And he was effective, but in the 5th inning, he walked a batter. So he brought in John Lester to relieve, who's normally a starter. And lurking in the background from the Cubs side was bringing in their closer, Aroldis Chapman, which happened later in the game. Chapman had pitched multiple innings in each of the previous 2 games, sandwiched around a day of rest. From the Indians side, their starter, Corey Kluber, who has the sharp downward breaking curveball, was very effective in games 1 and 4, but not in game 7. His pitches were coming in high, and so the Indian manager, Francona, had to pull him early and bringing in Andrew Miller, which my Yankees had. But in fact, there was a sidelight in terms of the Yankee aspect. On the trading deadline, July 31st, the Yankees traded Andrew Miller to the Indians for prospects, and then Aroldis Chapman to the Cubs for prospects. So there was definitely a Yankee aspect to this. And as it turned out, with both Miller in the game for the Indians and later on Chapman for the Cubs, both ace relievers struggled after having been effective before. So there were a lot of question marks about what should have been done. Did they pull the starters too soon, which I think was the case for the Cubs. In the Indians' case, Kluber was not effective. So both managers had to figure they didn't want the game to run away, as opposed to Game 6 when the Cubs scored early and that wasn't much of a contest.
And actually in Game 1, the Cubs were completely trounced, right? They made no score at all.
Yeah, Kluber, the Indians' ace, who won the Cy Young Award 2 years ago, was very effective in Game 1. So the Indians won 6-0, but in a way that was deceptive because Game 1 starter Lester actually pitched fairly well. He gave up 2 early runs. There was a wild pitch and some other stuff, so it's not like the Indians hit the ball hard. The only substantial run that Lester gave up was on a home run. Later on, the Indians tacked on 3 runs off one of the relievers, so actually Lester was fairly effective, but Kluber was really dealing in games 1 and 4.
Well, we have to take a break, and when we come back, let's go right back into this and do a play-by-play. So thank you. We'll be right back. Well, we're back to Middlesex Moments Radio Show, and Steve Krevisky is my guest today. I guess you win the World's Championship title for being the prognosticator of who might end up in the World Series in 2016, because you guessed the Cubs for sure on the national side, and you thought the Indians had a good shot at the American League. So kudos to you, Steve Krevisky. So now let's talk about these 7 games that a lot of people in this country were spending time watching on television, including you, I assume.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So what stands out to you as the biggest moments of this World Series? Other than the Cubs breaking a 108-year...
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. The last time the Cubs won was not only before we were born, but likely before our parents were born.
Right.
You know, a little brief word about the '08 Cubs and what was called the dead ball era, when the ball could be cut up and pitchers could throw the spitball and there weren't a lot of home runs. The Cubs actually from 1906 to 1910 had what could be called a dynasty because they were in the World Series in 1906, 07, 08, and also 1910.
Wow.
So they won the series in 07 and 08. For you listeners out there, the '06 Cubs won 116 games, but didn't win the World Series because they played their crosstown rivals, the Chicago White Sox, who were known as the Hitless Wonders. And in what I think could be considered an upset, the White Sox won that series. And that's the only time in this modern era that there was an all-Chicago World Series.
Yeah, that would be amazing to have the whole hometown on either side.
That's right.
Yeah.
And my understanding, and I've been in Chicago many times, that the White Sox and the Cubs don't exactly like each other. I mean, the Cubs play in Wrigley Field up on the north side. It's the second oldest major league park after Fenway. You know, the White Sox played in the old Comiskey, and now there's the new Comiskey, of course. The names change. So there is some rivalry there. But in that era, when the Cubs had people like Three-Fingered Brown, the great pitcher, and there was this poem about the Cubs infield, tinkers, devers to chance. The Cubs were a very powerful team. But then, as the listeners know, then there was such a long drought for them. But what's of also note, partly for me as a mathematician as well as the baseball, the Cubs won pennants in 1929, 1932, 1935, and 1938 every 3 years. And for them, unfortunately, they lost the World Series in each of those years. But they were generally very good in the decade of the 30s. And then their last World Series appearance prior to this year was 45 with the so-called Curse of the Billy Goat.
Right.
So there's a lot of history there.
Yeah, so you tell us about the dead balls and tell us about the Curse of the Billy Goat. So what about the dead balls?
In terms of what was called the dead ball era, definitely a pitcher's era. Pitchers were allowed to throw the spitball. They could, in some cases, cut the ball up. So the way baseball was played back in the dead ball era, there wasn't a lot of home runs. There were some high batting averages, but that someone could lead the league in home runs with maybe 10. And so there was a lot of bunting, stealing, hit and running, things of that nature, what was called inside baseball. So the game was played very differently. And then, of course, as a statistical point, you know, there's the balance between offense and defense. But you had, I think, a lot more low-scoring games in those days than you do have today. The modern era, where you started to see more home runs, began around 1919 and 1920 with the advent of Babe Ruth and then later Jimmy Fox, Lou Gehrig, Rogers Hornsby of your Cardinals and others. So with the advent of the home run, we went from what was a pitcher's era in the dead ball times to an offensive slugging era, especially in the 20s and 30s. So baseball has often gone back and forth in terms of different eras of the game and fluctuations between was it a pitcher's era and was it a batter's era. So in 1945, my understanding is that the Cubs were playing the Tigers in the World Series. And in one of the areas near Wrigley, there was this bar across the street, and the owner had a billy goat and wanted to bring a billy goat into the game. So they refused his entry, and he supposedly uttered this curse that the Cubs will never win again, something like that, which they just broke last night.
Yeah.
Now, one may or may not believe in those kinds of things, but the Cubs went into a sort of a malaise in the 50s and 60s. They had Ernie Banks, but they were usually doormats in the National League. They got better in the late 60s. Some listeners might remember the 69 Cubs collapse when the Mets caught them and won the World Series. And there were other later sort of tragic episodes when the Cubs might have done better. So there's a rich history there because the Cubs have been around since the 19th century.
There's so much rich history. I was thinking about the most recent news that I'd heard about Chicago, other than the World Series, was that they had reached a number, and I don't remember what it was, but it was way too high, of homicides in the city. So it's a city that's got a lot of tragic, urban reality around it. And so this game, winning this World Series, is going to, I have to believe, help restore some pride and identity in being from Chicago. It doesn't need to be Murderapolis anymore. It can also now be the World Series town.
Well, that's a good point because what you're saying, Anna, reminds me that back in 1968, which was one of the ultimate pitchers' eras, like the dead ball era, Detroit had a lot of issues, and unfortunately there's still a lot of urban problems there. But when the Tigers won the World Series in 68 and they came from 3-1 back against your Cardinals, sorry to say, I think that did help Detroit, in terms of their issues, that players like Willie Horton tried to sort of keep things calm. So,
yeah.
And sort of analogous to also after Katrina in New Orleans, when the Saints won the Super Bowl, that I think that did something similar in terms of making people feel better.
It lifts their spirits.
Yes.
I grew up in St. Louis. I do love the Cardinals. And honestly, when the games were on, when it was at the pennant time, they would literally stop teaching and turn the game on over the PA, and we'd sit in our desks and listen to the baseball game happen, which is, it was wonderful.
Good idea.
And Red Shangy's daughter was a student in my class, and he was the manager of
for many years
of the Cardinals. Yeah, so there were some really clear ties to it. But it was a town defined by baseball.
Yeah, St. Louis fans are very loyal, and they've generally had a lot of good teams over the years. And the Cardinal Hall of Fame list is pretty substantial. Musial, Medwick, Mize. I could go on about stuff like that.
Yeah, and I always love it when you do. But we should probably stay with the Chicago Cubs right now. And a little bit about the Cleveland Indians. I went to the Plain Dealer, which is the Cleveland newspaper, just to see how they were handling it. And there was this wonderful essay where they said, they might not have won the World Series, but they had an Indian summer. And apparently the weather was, apart from the 17 minutes of rain delay, it was a much warmer night than anybody anticipated. It was just a lovely experience. The Cubs obviously didn't have a home field advantage, and it was a neck-and-neck game last night, right?
Yeah, and it turned out that you talk about home field advantage, something I think you'll appreciate, Anna, when the Twins played the Cardinals in the 87 series.
I was there.
I can imagine you had mixed feelings.
Terrible,
That you have ties to both places, that was the first World Series where the home team won every game. Now, in those days...
And that was but they alleged that it was because they did it in the Metrodome, right? And the Metrodome, unlike Wrigley Field, is a covered, tented arena. The sound in there was phenomenal. You couldn't hear anything. It was like going to a rock concert afterwards. And what they said was when a ball would go up towards the tented roof, they would lose it. So if you weren't used to playing in that kind of environment, you couldn't see where the ball was to catch it. So they claimed it was an unfair advantage.
Well, I remember the Metrodome because my baseball group, the Society for American Baseball Research, or SABR, had its annual convention the next year in '88, and I remember being in the Metrodome, and that was the loudest place I've ever been.
Yeah, I know. It was incredible.
So I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But normally teams can win on the road. For instance, I did some research years ago about what happens in seventh games analogous to last night. So, for instance, from 1955 to 1958, the Yankees won the World Series each of those years, the first two against the Dodgers and the last two against the Braves. Each series went 7 games, and the road team won the 7th game each time. So as that connects to this series, the home team actually didn't win very often because the series opened in Cleveland, they split there, went to Chicago for 3. It's like what we call a 2-3-2 format. And so in Chicago, Cleveland won 2 out of 3, and then the Cubs won that 5th game that kept them alive, and then the Cubs won 2 in Cleveland, which I wasn't sure they'd be able to do. So therefore, the road team did very well, and so the home field advantage in baseball might not be as strong as in other sports. And regarding also what you said about Cleveland, with the Cavaliers having won the NBA title with the return of LeBron, then I'm sure they were hoping to get that sweep. So,
they absolutely were. Yeah.
Analogous to like in '79, the Pirates won the World Series and the Steelers won the Super Bowl. So I think a lot of people in Cleveland were hoping for that. And Cleveland really doesn't have the names that compared to the Cubs that a lot of people knew about Anthony Rizzo, Chris Bryant, and all the others. The Cleveland names were kind of relatively anonymous.
So I will just quote you again, and then we have to go to the break. You said the Indians, had a chance of making it to the World Series, but they have a lot of probable no names. So there we go again. All right, we'll be right back after this message, and we'll finish up on the World Series 2016. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, well, we're back to the final segment of Middlesex Moments Radio Show, and today my guest is Steve Krevisky, who is, omniscient about baseball and incredibly knowledgeable about baseball. And let me just turn it over to you. You were talking about the batters and the strike zone, so tell me what stands out in your mind about the Cubs game last night.
Maybe I was in the minority rooting for the Indians because I'm an American League fan, and I thought the Cubs were getting a lot of hype, but the Indians looked kind of dead in the water, and then all of a sudden they rallied, so I was happy about that. The Indians haven't won since 1948, but the Indians, at least since then, had been in the World Series at other times. The 54 Indians, who had the pitching staff with Lemon, Wynn, Garcia, and Feller, and Larry Doby, the first African-American in the AL, won 111 games, finishing 8 games ahead of the Yankees. And they played the New York Giants in the World Series, and the Giants swept them. That was the series of Mays' famous catch in center field in the Polo Grounds. That was considered a big upset, which was part of the idea that the best team doesn't always win. But the Indians were very good in that era, and then they went through a sort of malaise. A lot of people thought that when they traded Rocky Colavito, the home run hitter, to the Tigers for Harvey Keene in '59, that was the start of their decline, although there were other factors. And by the way, for you listeners out there, Terry Francona, the Indian manager, has a father, Tito Francona, who played for the Indians in that era in the late 50s. But the Indians, after a long malaise, did make the World Series in '95 and '97, although they lost both times. So at least the Indians' drought in that respect wasn't as long as the Cubs. But one of the things I wanted to mention that stuck out in my mind was in Game 1, Kluber versus Lester. I did have the impression that Lester was being squeezed in the strike zone, meaning that a lot of Lester's pitches, especially against right-handers, start as if they're going to be outside, and then they bend in and they break over the corner. The umpire was calling balls on some of those pitches that kind of did look like strikes. Sometimes on the TV they show the box, and they probably should do that more often. Kluber was really on his game in Game 1. He throws the sharp breaking ball that drops down, and maybe the umpire could see that better in terms of it being in the strike zone. So there were issues like that, not only in Game 1, but also later on. And I also noted that at times, a lot of the batters were really chasing pitches down in the dirt. Now granted, the batter really only has maybe about half a second to react to the speed of the ball. Is it rising? Is it falling? Is it away? Or is it in? But there were times when I thought batters were taking pitches down the middle that they should have swung at and then chasing pitches in the dirt. Now I think sometimes you're looking for a fastball and then you get the curve and then you start your swing You think the ball's in the plane of your bat, and all of a sudden it's dropping, but it's too late to check your swing. And I think the umpire had some tough calls in terms of did the batter go around. So what you saw at times was that the catcher would point to, let's say, the first base ump, and if the ump felt the batter had checked, they'd give the safe call. If they thought the batter went around, they'd give the out call, meaning it was a strike. So there were a lot of issues like that, along with there were a lot of challenges to calls, like a runner tried to steal second. There were challenges, and sometimes, although it slows the game down, you want to get the call right.
And did they reverse any of the calls?
In a few cases, yes, they did. Because also, one of the tough calls is that if the runner's approaching first base while there's a throw from the fielder, tie goes to the runner. In some cases, they had to show, like in slow-mo, did the batter's foot touch the bag before the ball went into the catcher's mitt? There were also a couple of cases where it wasn't clear as to whether the first baseman's foot was actually on the bag or did it come off.
Right. So who are the umps for World Series? Are they like the best umps from around the country? Are they
I think there's a process for getting the best umps. Normally in the regular season, there's 4 umpires, 1 at each base. In the World Series, you have the 4 at each base, plus one in left field, 1 in right field. The umps have a crew chief, and they rotate where they ump. So let's say in game 1, you'd have somebody back of home plate, and then it moves around so that the different umps get a chance to be either behind home plate or on the bases. And one of the things that I think ties into this discussion is what's the ump strike zone. A famous umpire from years ago, Bill Clem, who's in the Hall of Fame, was once quoted as saying something like, "It ain't nothing till I call it." So, in other words, when the ball comes in, some of it is the matter of how does the ump see the strike zone. So the strike zone was supposed to be from the knees to the armpits, but that varied over the years. If some umpires are favorable to a pitcher, they're going to give the pitcher a strike even if it's a few inches wide on either side or up or down a little bit. If they're more toward a hitter's umpire, although they would probably never admit to it, then they might squeeze the pitcher. If the ball comes in a couple of inches outside, then they're not going to call a strike, they're going to call it a ball. And this also was said historically that the different leagues called strikes differently because of the way the umps wore the chest protectors and the way they leaned over the catcher. So there were league differences as well. But they really should try to be consistent about the way they call it. Because, if a manager doesn't like a ball strike call, they can't come out and argue because they get ejected for that.
Right, exactly. Do you think that the umps, for example, last night in Cleveland were half from Chicago and half from Cleveland, or would they all have been Cleveland umpires?
I think it's really more of the leagues. So I would think that there would be American League umpires and also National League umpires, and that you would think they would try to confer about being consistent about the way they called stuff.
Right. There's got to be, I don't know, I suppose everybody on the field is under a lot of pressure, but the umpires are really under a lot of pressure.
It's tough, and if the umpire's doing their job and the game is running smoothly, you might not even notice that they're there. And on the other hand, if there's controversy over balls and strikes, or if there's a play at the plate, and there were some issues about that in terms of can the catcher block the plate and stuff like that. Then all of a sudden you might notice the umpire if something's going on and the manager comes out to argue.
So all of these players had gone through a very long season and played a lot of games. And there was some story last night about putting back into play a pitcher whose arm would have been tired because he had pitched too many previous games. Do you have an opinion about that? Was that part of the reason why the game went the way it went?
I think that's a good question because earlier I mentioned about Aroldis Chapman, who's the Cub closer whom the Cubs got from the Yankees at the trading deadline. One of the things that might be second-guessed is that the Cub manager, Joe Madden, who'd managed the Rays in the '08 series, brought in Chapman in the 6th game the day before for 1 and change innings. The Cubs had a 5-run lead, and one could argue they were probably going to win the game, which they did. Why not save Chapman for a 7th game? And so he had also pitched in Game 5, sandwiched around the travel day between 5 and 6. So it would seem like maybe he ran out of gas in the 7th game when the Indians miraculously rallied to tie it. And perhaps somewhat analogously with Miller, who had been very effective, he gave up 2 key runs yesterday that increased the Cubs' lead from 4-3 to 6-3. So one could question, in some respects, and maybe in hindsight, the strategies of pulling pitchers so early, especially when yesterday the Cubs starter Hendrick was doing very well, and they could have left him in till the 6th or 7th and not tired out their pen. Now, both managers had playoff experience because, in fact, an interesting sidelight for the listeners is that Terry Francona, the Indians manager, had previously managed the Red Sox to championships in 04 and 07, and the Cubs GM Theo Epstein was Francona's GM when the Red Sox were winning. So there was that sidelight of Francona going up against his former GM.
Right.
And there was also, aside from the Yankee aspect with Miller and Chapman, there were a number of former Red Sox in the game, such as John Lester, who started and relieved, the Cubs catcher David Ross, who was retiring, Coco Crisp, who'd been on the Red Sox. So there was that angle of players from local teams who also contributed.
There's actually a player named Coco Crisp.
That's his name.
Wow. Isn't there a cereal, Coco Crispy?
Yes, I think you're right.
Heavens. Yeah.
That's right.
I just love listening to these stories. I'm afraid the program is finished for today, but we will have you back, and we will be talking about looking ahead to the World Series, and then again next fall looking back at 2017's World Series. So thank you, Steve Krevisky, for being my guest today on Middlesex Moments Radio Show. This is Anna Wasesha wishing you all a very good day.